The Obsidian Orbit Station did not welcome visitors. It merely tolerated them. It was a jagged tooth of pressurized carbon and rusted titanium, biting into the silence of the void. Inside, the air was a thick soup of recycled sweat, ozone, and the metallic tang of burnt wiring. Kalen Vance adjusted the heavy, lead-lined wrench at his hip, feeling the familiar ache in his lower back. 45 years of life, half of them spent cutting through the hulls of dead warships as a holojack, had turned his body into a map of scars and stiff joints. "Papa, is she coming?" Pip asked for the 20th time that hour. The 5-year-old boy was perched on a stack of dented cargo crates, his small boots kicking rhythmically against the metal. He wore a miniature version of a flight suit, stained with grease and pride. Kalen sighed, the sound lost in the groan of the docking clamps. The Star Skipper, a freighter older than the station itself, had just latched onto Berth 7 Alpha. "I told you, kid, there is a mistake in the manifest. Nobody orders a person from a terminal like they are ordering a new atmospheric scrubber." "But the AI said she was the perfect match," Pip insisted, his eyes wide with the unshakable certainty of childhood. He gripped his battered toy robot, a one-armed thing he called Sparky. "She is a Bio-Synthesizer, Papa. She fixes things that are broken." Kalen grunted, rubbing the stubble on his chin. He had been too tired lately, working double shifts in the deeper vents to keep the credits flowing, leaving Pip with the station's semi-functional central computer for company. He should have known that the boy's curiosity would eventually bypass the firewalls. Pip was a natural with code, a trait he had inherited from a mother who was now nothing more than a digital ghost and a handful of star charts. The hydraulic hiss of the airlock cut through the ambient drone of the station. A cloud of sanitizing mist puffed out, smelling of harsh chemicals and artificial pine. The usual crowd of Obsidian Orbit's residents, gaunt miners with dust-clogged lungs and shifty-eyed merchants, stepped back instinctively. On this station, anything new was usually dangerous. Then she stepped out. She was nearly 6 feet tall, moving with a fluid grace that made the grated floor look like a ballroom. Her skin was the color of a pale emerald, catching the flickering overhead lights with a subtle, crystalline shimmer. Scales, fine as diamond dust, traced the lines of her high cheekbones and disappeared into the collar of her worn, high-collared tunic. Her hair was a waterfall of spun platinum, tied back with a leather cord, and her ears tapered into delicate points that twitched at the cacophony of the docking bay. The entire bay went silent. It was not out of respect. It was the silence of prey encountering a predator they did not recognize. Kalen felt his pulse quicken, not with romance, but with the old, hardwired instincts of a soldier. He shifted his stance, his hand hovering near the heavy-duty plasma cutter on his belt. She looked like an Ouroborean, the legendary terraformers from the spires of Xylos. They were supposed to be extinct, or at least confined to the guarded territories of the Inner Rim. What was one of them doing out here, on the edge of the grave planet Ethelgard? The woman scanned the crowd with eyes the color of molten amber. Her gaze landed on Kalen, lingered for a fraction of a second on his weathered face in defensive posture, and then dropped to the small boy jumping up and down on the crates. "Are you Pip?" she asked. Her voice was a low vibration, like the hum of a well-tuned engine, carrying an accent that tasted of ancient libraries in deep space. Pip let out a jubilant yelp. "Papa! See? I told you! She's here!" The woman walked toward them, her movements deliberate and calm. The miners parted like a receding tide, whispering under their breath. Green skin, crystal leech, biofreak. She ignored them, her chin held high, though Kalen noticed the slight tremor in her hands as she gripped the handle of her single battered travel case. "You must be Kalen Vance," she said, standing 4 feet away. "I am Eloan. According to the contract finalized through the Jirim interface, I have been assigned to this sector as your primary companion and biological consultant." Kalen stepped forward, placing himself between her and Pip. "Look, lady, I don't know what kind of scam you are running, but my kid is 5. He doesn't have the authority to sign contracts, and I certainly didn't authorize any biological consultants. We are FUBAR enough as it is without adding a soul bond lawsuit to the pile." Eloan's amber eyes didn't waver. "The contract is legally binding under the Interstellar Outreach Act, Mr. Vance. The transport fees consume my last 5,000 credits. My citizenship on Xylos has been revoked to facilitate this transfer. I have no return ticket, and I have exactly 3 liters of water and 2 nutrient bars left in my possession. She took a step closer, and for the first time, Kaylin saw the exhaustion behind the noble mask. Her scales were dull, a sign of dehydration or severe stress. I was told there was a man here who needed help fixing a world, she said softly. Was that a lie? Kaylin looked at Pip, who was looking at the woman with pure, unadulterated hope. Then he looked at the hostile faces of his neighbors, already calculating the scrap value of an Ouroborean's crystalline skin. Hell's bells, Kaylin muttered, a phrase he only used when things were about to get very complicated. Grab your bag, Elowen. We aren't discussing this in the open. As they walked toward the cramped corridors of the residential levels, Kaylin realized he wasn't just bringing home a stranger. He was bringing in a variable he couldn't control. On a station held together by spit and prayer, that was a recipe for a disaster. Check the 6, Pip, Kaylin barked, falling back into his old squad leader habits. Let's move. We have a lot of talking to do before the next shift starts. Elowen followed the man and the child through a labyrinth of shadows. Obsidian orbit was a dying beast. She could feel it in the soles of her feet. The vibration of the station's life support was erratic, a stuttering heartbeat that whispered of impending failure. To an Ouroborean, whose very biology was tuned to the resonance of the environment, the station was a scream of agony. Their quarters were located on level 9, a place where the gravity generators were notoriously temperamental. The room was small, cramped with shelves of mechanical parts, half-finished circuit boards, and a single, surprisingly clean sleeping nook for the boy. It's not the silver spires, Kaylin said, throwing his wrench onto a metal table. But it has a lock that works and a recycler that won't kill you today. Elowen set her case down and looked around. Her amber eyes settled on a holographic photo on a small shelf. It showed Kaylin, younger and less burdened, standing next to a woman with bright laughing eyes and a pilot's headset. My mother, Pip said, appearing at a low inside. She's in the stars now. Papa says she's helping navigate the big ships in the great beyond. Kaylin cleared his throat, a sharp, uncomfortable sound. Pip, go to the galley. See if you can find some of those dehydrated fruit strips for our guest. The boy scurried away, leaving in heavy silence in the room. Kaylin turned to Elowen, his arms crossed over his chest. All right, let's have it. Why did a high-tier terraformer from Xylos accept a match from a scrap heap station on the edge of the galaxy? The AI might be ancient, but it doesn't just pull people across 500 light-years for fun. Elowen sat on the edge of a chair, her back perfectly straight. You are a military man, Mr. Vance. You know that sometimes being sent is another word for being discarded. My people are traditional. They believe that if the land is dying, it is because the people have lost their way. I suggested that the land was dying because we were poisoning it with industrial waste. So they kicked you out, Kaylin concluded. Street slang would call that a dump and run. I was given a choice, recant my findings or be matched through the GRM system to a sector in need of biological revitalization. When the request from this station arrived, it was flagged as a high-priority emergency. It requested a Bio-Synthesizer to prevent a total ecosystem collapse. Kaylin rubbed his face with his hands. Pip. The kid was trying to fix the air scrubbers. He must have seen me looking at the failure reports. He didn't know he was asking for a person. He thought he was ordering a part. Elowen tilted her head, her gold hair shimmering like liquid metal. But the AI did not send a machine. It sent me. The GRM doesn't just look at technical requirements. It looks at psychological compatibility. It saw a child losing his home, a man losing his purpose, and a woman who had lost her world. It decided we were the solution to each other's problems. Logic is a fine thing, Elowen, Kaylin said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone. But logic doesn't put food in the bowl. This station is a graveyard. The planet below, Ethelgard, has been dead for 30 years. There is no ecosystem to revitalize. There is only dust and regret. Then why do you stay? She asked quietly. Because I'm void blind, that's why, Kaylin snapped, using the slang for someone who couldn't see the obvious truth. I stay because I have a ship that's mostly a heap of rust, a son who deserves better than a vacuum-sealed coffin, and I'm too stubborn to die. A slight sad smile touched Elowen's lips. Then we are the same. I have nothing left but my knowledge and these. She reached into a hidden pocket of her tunic and pulled out a small, glowing vial. Inside, hundreds of tiny luminescent spheres swirled in a slow rhythmic dance. Resonance seeds, she whispered. On silos, these could grow a forest in a week. Here, they might at least keep your air scrubbers running for another month. Kalen looked at the vial, then at the woman who had traveled across the stars because his son had made a mistake. He saw the pride in her eyes, the same pride he felt when he successfully cut through a reinforced bulkhead. She wasn't an opportunist. She was a survivor. 30 days, Kalen said, holding out a hand calloused by decades of hard labor. I can't promise you a future, and I can't promise the people on this station won't try to skin you for your vey, but I'll give you 30 days. We'll find a way to earn your passage back to the inner rim, or at least somewhere that isn't falling apart. Elowen looked at his hand, then reached out and took it. Her skin was cool like polished stone, but her grip was surprisingly strong. 30 days, she agreed. But I do not wish to go back, Kalen Vance. I wish to move forward. From the galley, Pip's voice drifted in, full of excitement. Papa, I found the fruit strips, and I think Sparky likes Elowen. He's not beeping as much. Kalen looked at his son, then at the green-skinned woman who was now part of his household. For the first time in 3 years, the crushing weight in his chest felt just a fraction lighter. Don't get comfortable, he told himself, even as he began to clear a space for her case. In space, hope was the most expensive thing you could own, and right now he was dangerously close to going into debt. He checked the time on his internal HUD. 2100 hours. The station groaned, a deep, structural sound that vibrated through their bones. Welcome to the Rust Hulk, Elowen, Kalen said, his voice softening. Try not to let the ghosts bite. As Elowen looked out the small, reinforced porthole at the dark, silent sphere of Ethelgard hanging below them, she felt a strange resonance. The planet wasn't dead. It was waiting. And for the first time in her exile, she felt like she had finally arrived exactly where she was meant to be. The morning on Obsidian orbit didn't begin with a sunrise, but with the harsh, flickering orange of the corridor lights cycling from dim to operational. Kalen Vance sat at the small, bolted-down kitchen table, staring into a mug of what the station's processors called coffee. It tasted like charcoal filtered through an old boot, but it was hot, and it was caffeinated, which was the only currency Kalen truly valued before 7 in the morning. Across from him, Elowen sat perfectly still. She didn't sleep in the way humans did. She entered a state of crystalline stasis, her scales dimming to a matte gray while her breathing slowed to a ghost of a rhythm. Now awake, her skin had regained its emerald luster, and she was watching Pip with a quiet, analytical intensity. Pip was currently busy trying to feed a piece of dehydrated nutrient bar to his one-armed robot, Sparky. He does that every morning, Kalen muttered, his voice gravelly from a lack of sleep. Thinks if he gives the bot enough calories, the second arm will grow back. Kid's got a static brain when it comes to logic sometimes. Elowen turned her amber eyes toward Kalen. It is not a lack of logic, Mr. Vance. It is an abundance of hope. In my culture, we say that the smallest seed requires the most imagination to see the forest within it. Yeah, well, imagination doesn't fix a broken actuator, Kalen retorted, draining the last of his sludge. He stood up, the joints in his knees popping like small caliber rounds. Listen, we have 30 days. That was the deal. You stay here, out of sight as much as possible. I've got a double shift on the derelict hauler docked at berth 9. The dust lungs, the miners, are already talking about the green skin that landed yesterday. This station is a pressure cooker, Elowen. People are looking for someone to blame for the bad air and the thinning rations. Don't give them a reason to pick you. Elowen bowed her head slightly. I understand the nature of fear, Kalen. It is the same on Xylos as it is on this Rust Hulk. But I am a scientist. I cannot simply sit in a room while the world around me is screaming in pain. The station isn't screaming. It's just old, Kalen said, grabbing his tool belt and his heavy armored jacket. Stay. Put. Pip, stay with her. Don't go poking around the vents today, you hear me? If I find out you're in the ductwork again, I'm locking your terminal for a week. Pip looked up, his face smudged with a bit of grease he'd found somewhere. Yes, Papa. Elowen is going to show me how to read the biorhythms of the air. Kalen groaned, gave his son a quick pat on the head, and headed for the airlock door. He had a job to do. The walk to Berth 9 took him through the gutter, the lowest inhabited level of Obsidian orbit. Here the walls were slick with condensation, and the air was so thin it made his head thrum with a dull ache. He passed a group of void eaters, salvage crews who looked more like skeletons wrapped in flak vests than men. "Hey, Vance," one of them called out. It was Harlan, a man whose lungs were 60% scar tissue from a venting accident 5 years ago. "Here you got yourself a fancy Ouroborean bride. Didn't know you had the credits for high-end crystal jewelry?" "Keep walking, Harlan," Kalen said without turning. "The kid made a mistake with the terminal. She's just a guest until I can get her a ticket out." "A guest? On this rock?" Harlan laughed, a wet rattling sound. "Nobody stays here as a guest, Vance. They stay because they're stuck. And word is, she's a biosynthesizer. Council's already sniffing around. They think she might be hiding some tech they can hawk to the inner rim." Kalen didn't answer. He couldn't. He knew Harlan was right. On Obsidian orbit, everyone was a predator or prey, and Alawan looked like a very shiny, very expensive prize. He reached the derelict hauler, a massive rib cage of a ship called the Iron Vulture. His job was to cut through the primary reactor shielding, a delicate, high-risk operation that required a holojack's steady hand. He spent the next 4 hours suspended by magnetic tethers in zero gravity, his plasma cutter screaming as it bit into the hardened lead steel. He was halfway through the third plate when his comm unit chirped. It wasn't the standard work channel. It was the emergency broadcast. "Attention all personnel. Atmospheric integrity breach detected in Sector 4 Gamma. Alert level, red, repeat. Alert level, red." Kalen froze. Sector 4 Gamma. That was the residential block. That was where Pip was. "Damn it," he cursed, his voice echoing inside his helmet. He didn't wait for his supervisor's permission. He disengaged his tethers, kicked off the Iron Vulture's hull, and used his suit's thrusters to propel himself toward the station's main access hatch. As he tumbled through the airlock and scrambled onto the station floor, he felt it. The wind. There shouldn't be wind inside a space station. A steady, terrifying whistle was echoing through the corridors, the sound of the station's lifeblood screaming out into the void. The emergency shutters were slamming down, orange lights strobing frantically. Kalen ran, his boots clanging against the metal. He passed people screaming, families huddling together as the pressure began to drop. His own lungs felt tight, the oxygen levels already dipping into the danger zone. He reached his quarters, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He slammed his palm against the doorpad. "Pip, Alawan!" The door hissed open. Inside, the room was a mess. Papers and spare parts were being sucked toward the ventilation duct in the ceiling. Pip was huddled under the table, gripping Sparky so hard his knuckles were white. Elowen was standing on a chair, her hands pressed against the vent. She was glowing, not just her scales, but her entire body was emitting a soft, pulsing emerald light. A thick, translucent substance, looking like a cross between amber and hardened sap, was oozing from her palms and sealing the gaps in the vent. "Kalen!" she cried out, her voice strained. "The secondary manifold has collapsed. The main seals are gone." Kalen didn't ask questions. He grabbed his heavy-duty sealant gun from his belt and moved to help her, but he could see it was useless. The sealant gun was designed for small cracks, not a structural failure of this magnitude. "The whole sector is venting, Elowen. We have to get to the escape pods." "No!" she shouted over the roar of the rushing air. "If this sector vents, the pressure drop will trigger a cascade failure in the gutter. Thousands will die, Kalen. I can hold it, but I need more mass." She looked down at Pip, then back at Kalen. In that moment, the bride he hadn't wanted and the soldier who had given up on the world locked eyes. "Help me," she whispered. Kalen dropped his sealant gun. He didn't go for the pods. He grabbed a heavy metal plate from his workbench, a piece of reactor shielding he'd been tinkering with. "Tell me where to put it." For the next 10 minutes, they fought the void. Kalen used his brute strength to hold plates against the bucking, screaming vents, while Elowen used her biological resin to fuse the metal to the station's hull. Her scales were bleeding now, a clear, iridescent fluid leaking from the edges of her crystalline skin. She was pouring her own life force into the seal. The whistling slowed. The roar turned into a hiss, and then, finally, into silence. The emergency lights transitioned from red to a steady, cautious yellow. The atmospheric sensors chirped, oxygen levels stabilizing at 42%. Kalen slumped against the wall, his chest heaving. He looked at his hands. They were covered in Alawan's strange, warm resin. He looked at her. She had fallen from the chair, her skin pale, almost translucent. Pip scrambled out from under the table and threw his arms around her neck. "You fixed it," the boy sobbed. "You fixed the air, Alawan." She didn't answer. She was unconscious, her breathing shallow and ragged. Kalen looked at the vent. It was a jagged, ugly patch of scrap metal and alien biological matter. It shouldn't have worked. It was a miracle, or a curse. Because as the sound of footsteps echoed in the corridor, Kalen knew the council was coming. And they weren't coming to thank her. They were coming to see the freak who could turn her own blood into a seal. He picked Alawan up in his arms. She was lighter than she looked, as if her bones were made of hollow glass. "Papa," Pip asked, looking up with tear-stained eyes. "Is she going to be okay?" Kalen looked at the door, his jaw set. "I don't know, Pip, but she just saved this whole damn station, and I'm not letting anyone take her until she wakes up." In the distance, the station's siren wailed, a long, mournful sound. The breach was closed, but the real storm was just beginning. 2 hours later, the residential quarters of Sector 4 Gamma were crawling with enforcers, the station's private security force. They wore mismatched armor and carried stun batons that hummed with a menacing low-frequency vibration. At their head was Counselor Pendrich, a man whose skin was the color of old parchment and whose eyes held the cold, calculating shimmer of a man who dealt only in profit margins. Kalen stood in the doorway of his quarters, his arms crossed. He had cleaned the resin off his hands, but a faint, floral scent still lingered in the air. The smell of Eloan's sacrifice. Inside, Eloan was lying on Kalen's bed, her breathing still labored. Pip sat by her side, holding a damp cloth to her forehead. "Out of the way, Vance," Pendrich said, his voice thin and sharp. "We have reports of unauthorized biological modifications to station property. The council needs to inspect the asset." "She's not an asset, Pendrich. She's a person," Kalen said, his voice like grinding stones. "And she's currently recovering from saving your miserable hides. If she hadn't patched that manifold, you'd be a frozen corpse floating toward Ethelgard right now." Pendrich sneered. "We have engineers for that, Vance. What she did, it's unregulated. It's alien tech. Do you have any idea what that kind of biological resin does to standard titanium alloys? It could be corrosive. It could be a tracking beacon for an Ouroborean invasion fleet." "An invasion fleet? Are you void-brained?" Kalen stepped forward, his height forcing Pendrich to look up. "The Ouroboreans are gone, Pendrich. Xylos is a restricted zone. She's in exile. She's got nothing but the clothes on her back and a heart that's apparently too big for this station." "Be that as it may," Pendrich said, waving a hand at his enforcers. "She is a variable the council cannot ignore. We are moving her to the medical wing for observation." Kalen didn't move. He reached down and touched the grip of the plasma cutter on his belt. It wasn't a weapon, not officially, but at close range it could melt through an enforcer's breastplate in 3 seconds. "The medical wing on this station is just a fancy name for the morgue," Kalen said softly. "She stays here, under my protection." The enforcers tensed. The air in the corridor grew heavy with the threat of violence. On Obsidian orbit, a holojack was a respected figure. You didn't cross a man who spent his days cutting through reactors unless you were prepared to die. "Papa?" Pip's voice came from inside the room. "She's awake." The tension broke, if only slightly. Kalen glanced back. Alawan was sitting up, her emerald scales flickering weakly. She looked at the crowd in the corridor, her amber eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and ancient weariness. "It is." "All right, Kalen," she said, her voice a mere whisper. "I will speak with them." Kalen frowned, but he stepped aside, allowing Pendrich to enter the cramped room. The counselor looked around with distaste, his eyes lingering on the mess of Pip's toys and Kalen's tools. "Miss Alawan, I assume," Pendrich said, keeping a safe distance. Your intervention today was noted. However, the use of unregistered biological agents is a violation of Station Code 14-9. You are required to provide a full genetic sample and a technical breakdown of the substance you used to seal the vent. Elowen looked at her hands where the cracks in her scales were still visible. It is not a substance, counselor. It is my lifeblood. It is the resonance of my people. To give you a breakdown would be to give you the blueprint of my soul. Spare me the Ouroborean mysticism, Pendrich snapped. This station is dying. Our scrubbers are failing, our seals are brittle, and the colony below is a tomb. If you have the means to repair this facility, it is your duty to provide it. You arrived here as a companion, did you not? That makes you the property of the resident who requested you. And since he is a minor, your status falls under the jurisdiction of the station's legal guardian, the council. Kalen's blood turned to ice. The hell it does. I signed the 30-day agreement. She is my guest. My responsibility. You signed a temporary housing permit, Vance, Pendrich countered, his eyes gleaming. The GRM contract is a different matter entirely, but perhaps we can reach a compromise. And he turned back to Elowen. Give us the formula for the resin. Show our engineers how to trigger the growth. Do that, and we will grant you a temporary residency permit. Refuse, and you will be placed in the brig for endangering the station with alien contaminants. Elowen looked at Kalen, then at Pip. She saw the fear in the boy's eyes and the simmering rage in the man's. She knew that if she refused, Kalen would fight. He would kill these men, and then he and Pip would be hunted across the station. They would lose everything because of a choice she had made. I cannot give you a formula, Elowen said, her voice regaining some of its musical strength, because there is none. The resin only forms in response to a biological need, a desire to protect. It is a symbiotic reaction. But I can show your engineers how to stabilize the existing patches. I can help you extend the life of your systems. Pendrich tapped a finger against his chin. Not quite the golden goose I was hoping for, but it's a start. Very well. You will report to the engineering deck at 0800 hours tomorrow. Vance, you will be held personally responsible for her conduct. If she so much as twitches toward an airlock, you're both going out of it without suits. Pendrich signaled his men, and they filed out of the room, the heavy thud of their boots fading into the distance. Kalen slammed the door shut and punched the lock. Damn it! You shouldn't have agreed to that. They'll bleed you dry, Elowen. They don't want your help. They want your skin. Elowen stood up, her legs shaky but holding. She walked over to Kalen and placed a cool hand on his armored shoulder. They want to survive, Kalen. That is a language I understand. And if I am to be a part of this family, even for 30 days, I must do more than hide. Family? Kalen barked, pulling away. This isn't a family. This is a cluster clank of bad luck and poor decisions. I'm a broken down soldier. He's a kid who plays with ghosts, and you're an exile with glowing blood. We aren't a family. We're just three people caught in the same vacuum. He turned his back on her, but he didn't see the way Elowen's amber eyes softened, or the way Pip took her hand and squeezed it. I don't care what Papa says, Pip whispered. You saved us. That makes you ours. The rest of the evening was spent in a tense, uncomfortable silence. Kalen worked on his plasma cutter, his movements sharp and angry. Elowen sat with Pip, helping him repair Sparky's missing arm with a bit of salvaged wire and a drop of her remaining resin. To her surprise, the robot's sensors flickered to life, the small optic sensor glowing a soft green instead of its usual flickering red. Look, Pip chirped. Sparky's happy. Kalen looked up from his workbench. He saw his son laughing, actually laughing, and he saw Elowen watching the boy with an expression of pure, unshielded tenderness. He thought about Eliza, his wife. He thought about the day the reactor had blown on the Sunseeker. He had been the lead holojack. He had been the one to call the all clear. He had been the one who watched the bulkhead buckle while his wife was on the other side. He had spent 3 years believing that anything he touched would eventually break. But here was Elowen, touching a broken toy and making it whole, touching a dying station and making it breathe. I'm going on the night shift, Kalen said suddenly, standing up. Need to make sure the Iron Vulture doesn't drift. Pip, get some rack time. Elowen, sleep. Tomorrow is going to be a long day in the guts. Kalen, Elowen called out as he reached the door. He stopped but didn't turn around. Thank you, she said, for not letting them take me. Don't thank me yet, Kalen muttered. The 30 days aren't up, and on this station, the void always finds a way in. He stepped out into the cold, metallic heart of the obsidian orbit, the smell of grease and broken promises wrapping around him like a shroud. He told himself he was doing this for the credits. He told himself he was doing it for Pip. But as he looked at the green resin still stuck in the seams of his armored jacket, he knew he was lying. He was doing it because for the first time in a long time, he didn't want to be alone in the dark. The next morning, the engineering deck was a cathedral of rust. Giant pistons, 3 stories high, hammered with a deafening rhythm, and the floor was covered in a layer of black oil that made every step a gamble. Elowen stood in the center of the chaos, surrounded by a dozen clankers, the station's grimy, cynical engineers. They stared at her with open hostility. All right, Sparky, one of them, a massive man named Grog, spat. Show us the trick. We've got a leak in the primary coolant loop that's been eating through standard patches like their paper. If your spit is so special, let's see it work on a high-pressure line. Kalen stood a few paces back, his hand on his plasma cutter. He saw the way they were looking at Elowen, like she was a new piece of equipment they were eager to stress test. Elowen walked toward the coolant line. It was a thick, vibrating pipe that was spraying a mist of toxic blue fluid into the air. The temperature in this part of the guts was over 40 degrees Celsius, and the humidity was near 100%. She closed her eyes. Her scales began to pulse. She's doing it, Pip whispered from behind Kalen. He had snuck along, refusing to stay behind. Elowen reached out. She didn't just touch the pipe. She seemed to listen to it. She placed her palms over the leak, and the green glow intensified. The blue mist began to hiss as it came into contact with her skin. Kalen could see the pain in her face. The coolant was freezing cold, and it was burning her. Elowen, back off, Kalen shouted. It's too much pressure. I have it, she gasped. The emerald resin erupted from her skin, flowing over the leak. It hardened instantly, forming a crystalline knot that pulsed with a rhythmic light, matching the vibration of the pipe. The spray stopped. The hissing ceased. The engineers stood in silence. Grog stepped forward and poked the patch with a heavy wrench. It didn't budge. It was stronger than the steel it was bonded to. I'll be a son of a space slug, Grog muttered. It worked. But Elowen collapsed. Kalen caught her before she hit the oily floor. Her hands were blackened from the frost burn of the coolant, and her glow was almost gone. That's enough for today, Kalen roared, his eyes flashing with a fury that made even Grog take a step back. She's done! Get back to your stations. He carried her toward the elevator, Pip running alongside him. As the doors closed, Kalen looked at Elowen's ruined hands. Why? He hissed. Why would you go that far for a coolant pipe? Elowen opened her eyes, her pupils dilated with pain. It was not for the pipe, Kalen. It was for the people who breathe because of it. On Xylos, we do not choose who to save. We save the world, or we save nothing. Kalen looked at her, and for the first time, he didn't see an alien. He didn't see a bride. He saw a soul that was far too bright for the darkness of obsidian orbit. You're a fool, Elowen, he whispered, his voice trembling. Perhaps, she breathed, but I am your fool for the next 28 days. As they ascended back toward the residential levels, Kalen made a decision. He wasn't going to let Pendrich or the council use her up until there was nothing left. He had a ship. It was a piece of junk, but it had a warp drive and enough oxygen for 3. If they were going to survive, they couldn't stay on the Rust Hulk. They had to go down. To the planet they all called a tomb, because if Elowen could fix a coolant pipe with her blood, what could she do with an entire world? Pip, Kalen said, his voice firm, pack your things, and the heavy-duty batteries. We're going to the Stargazer. Are we leaving, Papa? Kalen looked at Elowen, who was watching him with a faint, hopeful shimmer in her amber eyes. No, Pip, Kalen said. We're going to work. We're going to see if your choosing mama can really wake up a dead world. The station groaned around them, a sound of metal fatigue and ancient dust. But for the first time, it didn't sound like a death rattle. It sounded like an awakening. The hangar bay of Berth 12 was a cavern of weeping oil and forgotten machinery, tucked away in the station's blind spot, a sector where the surveillance cameras had been accidentally shorted out by Kalen 3 years prior. In the center of this gloom sat the Stargazer. She was a modified Type 4 utility hauler, a snub-nosed beast of a ship that looked more like a bruised thumb than a vessel of exploration. Her hull was a patchwork of dull lead gray and oxidized copper, held together by high-tensile welds and Kalen's sheer refusal to let her die. "She's beautiful, isn't she?" Pip whispered, his small hand gripping the handle of a heavy gear bag. He had stuffed his belongings into a single sack: 3 pairs of socks, a collection of smooth stones from the station's hydroponics bay, and Sparky, who was currently tucked into the boy's chest harness. Kalen grunted, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of Pendrich's enforcers. "She's a bucket of bolts, Pip, but she's our bucket of bolts. Now get up the ramp, fast, and stay in the jump seat until I say otherwise." Elowen followed, her steps light and careful. She looked pale in the dim light, her emerald scales appearing almost translucent. Since the incident in the engineering deck, she had been moving with a noticeable hitch in her stride. Her hands were still wrapped in medical gauze, the green resin having hardened into a protective, if painful, shell over her frost-burned skin. "Kalen," she said, her voice barely audible over the hum of the station's distant ventilation, "if the council finds out we have left the station, they will mark this ship for terminal decommissioning. You are risking Pip's safety for a theory." "I'm risking his safety by staying," Kalen retorted, slamming the hydraulic seal on the primary hatch. The sound echoed through the ship's cargo hold like a funeral bell. "On Obsidian orbit, he's just a future dust lung. Down there, well, at least we can breathe the air we bring with us. Now get to the cockpit. I need you to act as a bioscanner. My sensors are 40% blind below the cloud layer." The cockpit of the Stargazer was a cramped space, smelling of ozone and old leather. Kalen slid into the pilot's seat, his hands moving across the controls with a grace born of 20 years in a cockpit. He didn't need to look at the dials. He could feel the ship's heartbeat through the vibrations in the floor. "Engaging pre-flight," Kalen muttered. "Check the 6, Pip." "6 is clear, Papa. No squids on the radar," Pip chirped, using the street slang for the station's bulbous surveillance drones. "Good. Allowance, strap in. The descent through Ethelgard's atmosphere is a real teeth rattler. The copper mists create a static shear that'll turn your stomach inside out." "I have endured worse than turbulence, Kalen," she replied, though her fingers tightened on the armrests of the co-pilot's seat. Kalen punched the ignition. The Stargazer groaned, her thrusters coughing out a plume of blue-white fire as they disengaged from the magnetic moorings. There was no grand departure, no fanfare. They slipped out of the hangar like a thief in the night, a small dark shape falling away from the gargantuan, glowing skeleton of Obsidian orbit. As they cleared the station's gravity well, the planet Ethelgard filled the view screen. From the station it looked like a marble of rusted iron. But as they plummeted toward the atmosphere, the colors began to shift. The clouds were a thick, roiling sea of amber and burnt sienna, occasionally lit by the violet flashes of ion storms. "Entering the shroud," Kalen announced, his jaw set. The ship hit the upper atmosphere with a bone-shaking jolt. Warning lights flickered across the dash in a frantic dance of crimson and amber. The Stargazer shrieked as the friction of the descent clawed at her shielding. "Static buildup is off the charts," Kalen shouted over the roar. "Elowen, I need a resonance fix. The radar is foobar." Elowen closed her eyes. She didn't look at the screens. She leaned forward, her forehead almost touching the reinforced glass of the viewport. Her scales began to pulse, a soft, rhythmic emerald light that seemed to cut through the static interference. 3 degrees to port," she murmured, her voice steady despite the ship's violent bucking. "There is a pocket of low-density air. Follow the vibration of the earth below. It is calling." "Calling? What are you talking about?" Kalen gritted his teeth, fighting the control stick. "The planet," Elowen said, her eyes snapping open. They were glowing with an intensity Kalen had never seen. "It is not dead, Kalen. It is silent, like a person holding their breath. Move to the left. Now!" Kalen hauled the stick to the side. The ship groaned, the hull plates screaming in protest. but they slipped into a calm pocket of air. The violet lightning vanished, replaced by a dull, hazy twilight. They were below the clouds. Ethelgard stretched out beneath them, a world of jagged obsidian mountains and vast gray plains of silicate dust. There were no oceans, no forests, no signs of the agricultural paradise it had once promised to be. It was a skeletal world, picked clean by time and neglect. 30 kilometers to the silent spires, Kalen said, his voice quiet. That was the primary research hub during the first colonization wave. If there's anything left of the soil data, it'll be there. Papa, look! Pip pointed at the horizon. In the distance, 3 massive, spindly towers rose from the dust, looking like the fingers of a buried giant. They were the silent spires, once the pride of the colonial authority, now just rusted monuments to human hubris. Kalen brought the Stargazer in for a landing, the ship's landing struts hissing as they sank into the soft, gray ash of the plain. He killed the engines, and for a moment, the only sound was the cooling of the ship's metal, a series of pings and clicks that felt unnervingly loud in the absolute silence of the planet. "We're here," Kalen said, exhaling a breath he felt he'd been holding since they left the station. "Oxygen levels are at 12% out there. High CO2. We'll need the rebreathers." They suited up in silence. Kalen checked Pip's seals 3 times, his hands trembling slightly. This was the turning point. If Elowen was wrong, they had just burned their bridges for a pile of dust. They were officially AWOL, and the council would likely have a kill-on-sight order out by morning. The airlock hissed open, and the ramp lowered. Kalen stepped out first, his boots crunching on the silicate surface. The wind was a low, mournful whistle, carrying the taste of copper and dry stone. He looked up. The sky was a bruised purple, the clouds of the upper atmosphere blocking out the sun. Elowen stepped onto the ramp, but she didn't walk. She knelt. She reached out with her bandaged hands and pressed her palms directly into the gray ash. Kalen watched her, his hand on his holster. "Well, is it as dead as it looks?" Elowen didn't answer for a long time. She stayed there, her eyes closed, her scales shimmering in a slow, undulating pattern. Then a single crystalline tear tracked down her green cheek. "It is hungry," she whispered. "The soil, it has been stripped of its song, but the roots are still here, deep beneath the ash. They are waiting for a reason to wake up." "I don't see any roots, Elowen. I just see ash," Kalen said, his military pragmatism warring with the strange hope blooming in his chest. "You see with your eyes, Kalen. You must learn to see with your heart," she said, standing up. She looked at the spires. "The truth is in those towers. The reason the world stopped breathing, we must find it." As they began the long walk toward the spires, Kalen felt a prickle at the back of his neck. He looked back at the Stargazer, a lone spark of metal in a gray world. He had spent his life cutting things apart to see how they worked. For the first time, he was with someone who wanted to put things back together. But the cost of repair was always higher than the cost of destruction. And on Ethelgard, the bill was about to come due. The interior of the silent spires was a ghost realm of flickering emergency lights and data screens that had long since bled into static. The air was stale, smelling of cold plastic and the dry metallic tang of the planet's dust that had managed to seep through the ancient seals. Kalen led the way, his tactical flashlight cutting a bright, lonely path through the darkness. Pip walked close behind him, his hand gripping the hem of Kalen's jacket. Elowen brought up the rear, her presence a soft, emerald glow that seemed to push back the shadows more effectively than Kalen's light. "Keep your eyes peeled, Pip," Kalen whispered, his voice echoing in the hollow metal corridor. "This place is a hard zone. We don't know if the automated defenses are still live." "I'm not scared, Papa," Pip said, though his voice wavered. "Sparky is scanning for ghosts." They reached the central archives, a circular room filled with towers of crystalline data storage. Most of them were dark, their energy cells drained decades ago. But in the center of the room, one terminal hummed with a low, dying light. "Elowen, see if you can interface," Kalen said, stepping back to watch the door. "My tech skills are for breaking into things, not talking to them." Elowen approached the terminal. She didn't use a keyboard. She placed her hands on the crystalline surface, her scales pulsing in a rapid, complex rhythm. The terminal flickered, the light turning from a pale blue to a deep, resonant green. I am accessing the core logs, she murmured. The final days of the Ethelgard colony. Images began to flicker across the surrounding walls, holographic ghosts of a world that once was. They saw fields of golden grain, children playing under a blue sky, and forests of silver-leaf trees. It was beautiful. It was a lie. Wait, Kalen said, stepping closer. Fast forward to the end. I want to see what the blight actually was. The images blurred, the gold turning to gray, the blue sky turning into the bruised purple they had seen outside. The holographic figures were no longer playing. They were huddled in the spires, their faces gaunt with a familiar, hollow-eyed exhaustion. A recording began to play. A woman in a scientist's lab coat, her eyes red from weeping, spoke to the camera. Log entry 4112. The extraction is complete. The Council on Obsidian Orbit has authorized the Deep Pulse Protocol. They told us it would only take the excess thermal energy from the planet's core to power the station's new refineries. They lied. The pulse didn't just take the heat, it shattered the planetary resonance. The soil isn't just dead, it's been silenced. The bacteria can't communicate. The plants can't draw nutrients. We are leaving. Ethelgard is no longer a home. It is a battery that has been drained to the husk. The recording ended in a burst of static. Silence fell over the room, heavier than the dust outside. Kalen looked at the dark screens, his heart feeling like a lead weight in his chest. They did it, he whispered. The Council. They didn't just fail to save the planet. They murdered it. They turned the world into a power source for the station. Elowen's glow had dimmed to a faint, sickly light. She was trembling. They stole the heartbeat of the world. No wonder the planet feels so cold. It was betrayed by the very people it was trying to feed. Papa? Pip looked up, his face pale. Does that mean the Council is bad? Kalen knelt down and grabbed Pip's shoulders. It means they made a choice, Pip. They chose the station over the world. They chose now over forever. And they're still doing it. That's why Pendrich wants Alawan. He doesn't want her to fix anything. He wants her to be the new battery. Before he could say more, a sharp metallic clank echoed from the corridor. Contact! Kalen barked, pulling Pip behind him and drawing his plasma cutter. From the shadows, three shapes emerged. They weren't humans. They were sentry hounds, four-legged combat drones with articulated limbs and red optic sensors that burned like embers. They were old, their chassis rusted and pitted, but their weapon systems were hummed with a deadly, high-pitched whine. Fubar, Kalen hissed. The defense grid just woke up. The lead hound let out a burst of static and lunged. Kalen fired. The plasma bolt hit the drone in the chest, melting through the armor, but the machine didn't stop. It was a Zed model, built to function even with 50% structural damage. Elowen, get back! Kalen shouted, firing again. He fought with the desperation of a man who had everything to lose. He moved like a whirlwind of armored leather and white-hot fire, his reflexes taking over. He kicked one hound back, its metal ribs crunching under his heavy boot, and blasted the second one's optic sensor. But there were more. A dozen more hounds were pouring into the room from the ventilation shafts. There are too many, Pip screamed. Elowen stepped forward. She didn't have a weapon. She didn't have a shield. She simply raised her hands, her scales erupting into a blinding emerald light. Stop! She cried out. The sound wasn't a voice. It was a physical wave of resonance. It hit the drones like a hammer. Their optic sensors flickered, their joints locked, and they collapsed into heaps of useless metal. The green light filled the room, vibrating through the walls, through the floor, through the very bones of the people standing there. And then, the light vanished. Elowen slumped to her knees, her breath coming in short, agonizing gasps. The green resin was leaking from her eyes now, looking like glowing tears. Kalen ran to her side, his heart hammering. Elowen! What did you do? I gave them a new song, she whispered, her head lolling back. I told them, the world is not a battery, but it took everything, Kalen. She collapsed into his arms, her body cold as the obsidian mountains outside. We have to get back to the ship, Kalen said, his voice cracking. Pip, grab the emergency med kit from my belt, now. As they scrambled back through the darkened corridors, Kalen realized the true cost of his choice. He had wanted to find a way to fix the world, but he was losing the person who knew how. They reached the airlock of the spires and stepped out into the gray ash. But they weren't alone. 3 ships were descending from the purple clouds. They were Council interceptors, sleek, black, and armed to the teeth. They were landing in a triangle around the Stargazer, their searchlights cutting through the haze like accusing fingers. "Vance!" a voice boomed over a long-range loudspeaker. It was Pendrick. "You are in possession of Council property. Surrender the Ouroborean now, and your son will be spared. Refuse, and we will glass this entire sector." Kalen looked at Elowen, unconscious in his arms. He looked at Pip, who was clutching his leg, trembling with terror. He had a choice. He could give them Elowen. He could take Pip and fly away, back to the station, back to the safety of the Rust Hulk. He could live his life in the shadows, a good soldier who followed orders and kept his head down. Or he could stay. He could fight for a woman he barely knew, for a planet that was mostly dust, and for a son who deserved to know that family wasn't about who you were born to, but who you were willing to die for. Kalen Vance looked up at the black ships, his jaw tightening until it ached. He didn't feel like a soldier anymore. He didn't feel like a holojack. He felt like a father. "Pip," Kalen said, his voice low and steady, "get Elowen into the ship. Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone but me." "But Papa, what about you?" Kalen pulled his plasma cutter and checked the energy cell. "I'm going to have a talk with the counselor. I think it's time he learned that some things aren't for sale." "Wait!" Elowen's voice was a ghost of a sound. She had opened her eyes. She reached out and grabbed Kalen's wrist with surprising strength. "Do not fight them, Kalen. Not like that. They only understand power. We must show them life." She looked at the gray ash at her feet. She leaned over, and with a final agonizing effort, she pressed her hand into the dirt. A pulse of emerald light rippled out from her fingers, moving through the ash like a wave. For a second, nothing happened. Then a tiny silver sprout broke through the silicate dust. It was small, no bigger than a finger, with a single shimmering leaf that caught the light of the Council's searchlights. It was a resonance tree, the first bit of life Ethelgard had seen in 30 years. The searchlights from the interceptors wavered. The voice on the loudspeaker went silent. Kalen looked at the sprout, then at Elowen, then at his son. The turning point hadn't been the escape, or the drones, or the discovery of the Council's crimes. The turning point was right here, in the dirt. "She did it," Kalen whispered, tears finally blurring his vision. She actually did it. But the black ships were still there. And Pendrich was not a man who believed in miracles. He only believed in ownership. "Beautiful," Pendrich's voice came over the speaker, colder than ever. "A prototype. Seize them. All of them." Kalen stood over the silver sprout, his plasma cutter humming. The test of his life had begun. He had chosen his family. Now he had to see if he was strong enough to keep them. "Come and get us, you suit-wearing coward," Kalen spat into his comm unit. "But be warned, the world is waking up. And it's a long way down from the station." The interceptor's weapons pods opened. The gray planes of Ethelgard were about to turn red. The searchlights of the 3 interceptors crisscrossed over the gray plains of Ethelgard, like the glowing lances of ancient knights. The dust kicked up by their thrusters swirled into a localized storm, turning the air into a gritty, violet haze. Inside the Stargazer, the emergency lights hummed a low, anxious song. But outside, Kalen Vance stood alone in the shadow of the boarding ramp. He held his heavy-duty plasma cutter in a 2-handed grip, the energy cell whining as it cycled to full power. At his feet, the tiny silver sprout shimmered, a defiant spark of life in a world of silicate and rot. "Vance, don't be a skaghead," Pendrich's voice boomed from the lead interceptor, amplified by the external speaker grill until it vibrated Kalen's teeth. "You're a civilian salvage jack with a ship that's 70% rust. You're facing 18 Council enforcers with Mark IV pulse rifles. Do the math. There is no scenario where you walk away from this if you keep that trigger depressed." Kalen spat into the dust, the moisture instantly beginning to evaporate in the thin, dry air. "I was never very good at math, counselor, but I'm real good at knowing when a man is lying through his teeth. You don't want us to surrender. You want to erase the evidence that this planet can still breathe. Because if Ethelgard wakes up, your monopoly on the station's oxygen goes out the airlock, doesn't it? There was a long, static-filled silence. Then, the hatch of the lead interceptor hissed open. Pendrich didn't step out. He was too cowardly for the copper miss. But 6 enforcers did. They moved in a tactical wedge, their boots clanking against the hard-packed obsidian ground. Their armor was pristine, a stark contrast to Kalen's patched leather and the grease-stained flight suit he'd worn for 5 years. "Last chance, Vance," the lead enforcer called out, his voice muffled by his helmet's respirator. "Drop the cutter and step away from the green skin. We have orders to retrieve the biological asset. You and the brat are collateral." Kalen felt a cold, sharp clarity settle over him. It was the feeling he used to get before a breach and clear mission during the Dominion War. The world slowed down. He could hear the whistle of the wind through the spires, the thrum of the Stargazer's failing reactor, and the soft, ragged breathing of Elowen behind the ship's reinforced hatch. "Pip," Kalen whispered into his internal comlink, his voice steady. "Are you listening?" "I'm here, Papa," the boy's voice came back, small and trembling, but clear. "I need you to do exactly what I told you. Go to the cockpit. Engage the secondary fuel pump. If I give the signal, you punch the ignition, and you get the ship to the other side of the spires. Do you understand?" "But Papa, what about you? What about Elowen? She's really sick." Kalen looked at the silver sprout. For 3 years, he had been a ghost, a man who lived for nothing but the next paycheck and the safety of his son. He had treated the world like a machine to be salvaged, a series of broken parts that could never be truly whole again. But Elowen had looked at the dust and seen a garden. She had looked at a broken soldier and seen a father. "Family isn't just about who we're born to, Pip," Kalen said, his voice thick with a sudden, overwhelming emotion. "Sometimes it's about who we choose to stand in front of. I'm choosing her, and I'm choosing you. Now go. That's an order, soldier." "Yes, Papa," Pip whispered. The lead enforcer raised his pulse rifle. "Target acquired. Open fire." The world exploded into violet light. Kalen dived behind a stack of silicate cake cargo crates he'd unloaded earlier. The pulse rounds hit the crates with the force of sledgehammers, sending shards of crystallized dust flying in every direction. He rolled to the left, came up on one knee, and fired a burst from his plasma cutter. The white-hot beam sliced through the lead enforcer's rifle, turning it into a useless hunk of molten plastic. "Suppressive fire," one of the enforcers barked. Kalen was pinned. He was one man with an industrial tool against an organized squad. He knew he couldn't win a stand-up fight. He needed to be a holojack. He needed to use the environment. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a handful of flare caps, small magnesium-based ignition pellets he used for lighting dark ship hulls. He threw them into the air and fired a low-intensity plasma bolt into the center of the cluster. The result was a blinding, white-gold flash that reflected off the copper mist, creating a wall of glare that the enforcer's sensors couldn't filter fast enough. "I'm blind. My HUD is whited out." Kalen didn't waste a second. He scrambled toward the Stargazer, but he didn't go for the ramp. He went for the ship's external atmospheric venting port. He yanked the manual override, and a massive plume of concentrated nitrogen and recycled carbon dioxide roared out, creating a thick artificial fog that obscured the entire landing site. "Pip, now!" Kalen shouted. The Stargazer's engines coughed, then roared to life. The ship didn't lift off. Instead, it used its maneuvering thrusters to pivot, the backwash of the engines hitting the approaching enforcers like a physical wall of heat and grit. In the chaos, Kalen ran for the boarding ramp. He slammed the controls, and as it hissed shut, he saw Elowen. She was standing in the middle of the hold, leaning against a support strut for balance. Her eyes were no longer amber. They were glowing with a terrifying, radiant green light. Her scales were standing on end, vibrating with a frequency that made the very air hum. "Elowen, we have to go. The ship is prepped." She looked at him, and Kalen saw a woman who was no longer in exile. She was a force of nature. "They will not stop, Kalen. They will hunt us to the edge of the galaxy because they are afraid of the song." "Then we change the song," Kalen said, grabbing her by the waist to steady her. "But we do it from the sky. We aren't dying in the dirt today." He carried her to the cockpit and shoved her into the co-pilot's seat. Pip was already there, His small hands gripped white-knuckled around the secondary controls. "Strap in!" Kalen roared, slamming into the pilot's seat. He hauled back on the stick. The Stargazer screamed, her old engines straining against the planet's gravity. Outside, the interceptors were firing their heavy cannons now, the shells whistling past the hull. One hit the starboard wingtip, sending a shudder through the ship that nearly threw Pip out of his seat. "Shields at 20% and falling," Pip yelled, his voice cracking. "Papa, the squids are locking on." "Not today, you empty suits." Kalen gritted his teeth, his eyes fixed on the purple horizon. He didn't fly toward the station. He flew toward the heart of the ion storm roiling over the Obsidian Mountains. It was a suicide move. No ship of this class could survive the electrical shear of a level 5 Ethelgard storm. "Vance, you're flying into a death trap." Pendrich's voice crackled over the radio, sounding genuinely panicked now. "Turn back. We can still negotiate." Kalen reached out and flipped the radio switch to off. He looked at Elowen. Her hand, still blackened from the frost burn, reached out and covered his own on the control stick. "Do you trust me?" he asked, the words feeling like a vow. "With every resonance of my being," she replied. "Pip, hold on to Sparky. It's about to get bumpy." The Stargazer dived into the purple wall of the storm. Lightning, thick as tree trunks, arced across the sky, striking the hull and turning the interior of the ship into a strobe-lit nightmare of sparks and smoke. The gravity well fluctuated, throwing them against their harnesses. But as they reached the eye of the storm, something changed. Elowen didn't scream. She didn't hide. She began to sing. It wasn't a song with words. It was a series of low, rhythmic pulses that seemed to harmonize with the electrical discharge of the storm. The green light from her scales flowed into the ship's controls, into the very wires of the Stargazer. The ship stopped shaking. The warning lights turned from red to green. The hull, which should have been melting under the ion stress, began to glow with a soft emerald aura. Kalen watched in awe as the Stargazer became a part of the storm. They weren't fighting the planet anymore. They were riding it. "Look!" Pip pointed out the viewport. Below them, as they cleared the mountains, the emerald light from the ship was rippling downward, striking the gray ash of the plains. Wherever the light touched, the silver sprouts were erupting by the thousands. The song Elowen was singing was being amplified by the ion storm, broadcasting the planetary resonance across the entire hemisphere. The planet was waking up, and it was screaming a message to the station above. "We are no longer your battery." "They can't stop it now," Kalen whispered, his heart soaring. "No matter what happens to us, they can't stop the world from breathing." He looked at Elowen. She had slumped back into her seat, her eyes closed, but a peaceful smile was on her face. She had given her choice. She had chosen to be the bridge. "We're through the storm, Papa," Pip yelled. "The sky, it's changing." Kalen looked up. Above the purple clouds, for the first time in 30 years, a single patch of blue was visible, a window to the stars. "Yeah, Pip," Kalen said, his voice cracking. "It's a real sky, just like I promised." But as he looked at his scanners, his heart sank. 2 of the Council interceptors had survived the storm. They were damaged, their hulls scorched, but they were still coming. And behind them, a massive shadow was blotting out the blue. The Obsidian orbit station itself was moving out of its geostationary track. Pendrich was bringing the Rust Hulk down to finish the job. The shadow of the Obsidian orbit station fell over the plains like the hand of a vengeful god. It was a gargantuan, irregular mass of metal and rock, 4 kilometers long, its thousands of docking lights twinkling like cold, judgmental eyes. It shouldn't have been able to enter the atmosphere. Its structural integrity was designed for the vacuum of space, not the crushing pressures of planetary flight. But Pendrich had overridden the safety protocols. He was dropping the station like a kinetic hammer, intended to crush the spires and the emerging greenery into a smear of glass and ash. "He's insane," Kalen whispered, staring at the descending Titan on his view screen. "He's going to break the station apart just to kill one silver forest." "He is not insane, Kalen," Elowen said, her voice weak but steady. She was leaning against the cockpit console, her skin a dull, matte green as she struggled to recover from the resonance burst. "He is terrified. He knows that if life returns to this world, the system of control he built, the scarcity, the fear, the Rust Hulk mentality, it all evaporates. He would rather rule a graveyard than be a citizen in a garden. The stargazer was limping. The ion storm had spared their lives, but it had fried the primary thrusters. They were gliding on emergency power, circling the silent spires while the two remaining Council interceptors harried them like wolves around a wounded elk. "Papa, the big ship is getting closer," Pip cried out. He was standing on his seat, his small face pressed against the glass. "It's going to hit the spires. All the baby trees will die." Kalen looked at his son, then at Elowen. This was it, the moment every soldier fears, the choice between the people you love and the mission that matters. "If I fly the Stargazer into the station's primary docking ring," Kalen said, his voice terrifyingly calm, "I can trigger a localized reactor overload. It won't destroy the station, but it'll force their emergency thrusters to fire upward. It'll push them back into orbit." "Kalen, no!" Elowen gasped, reaching for his arm. "The ship is too damaged. You would never eject in time." "I'm not talking about an ejection, Elowen." Kalen turned to face her. He took her hands in his, one rough and scarred, the other smooth and crystalline. "I've spent 45 years being a holojack. I've spent my life salvaging the past because I was too scared to build a future. But look at Pip. Look at what you did to this world in one afternoon." He leaned in and pressed his forehead against hers. "You're the choosing mama, Elowen. You chose us when you had every reason to run. Now it's my turn to choose. I'm choosing a world where my son doesn't have to live in a tin can." "Papa?" Pip's voice was small, filled with a sudden, terrible understanding. "You're not coming with us, are you?" Kalen knelt down in the cramped cockpit and pulled Pip into a crushing hug. He could smell the grease on the boy's flight suit, the scent of the fruit strips they'd shared, and the lingering ozone of the storm. "Listen to me, Pip. You're 10 times the man I ever was. You're smart, you're brave, and you have the best mother in the galaxy. I need you to take the Stargazer's emergency pod. It's got its own atmospheric thrusters. You and Elowen go down to the spires. You stay with the trees." "No, I won't go. I won't let you," Pip sobbed, his small fist thumping against Kalen's armored chest. Kalen looked at Elowen. His eyes were pleading. "Take him, Elowen, please. Give him a world with a real sky." Elowen's amber eyes were swimming with tears, but she saw the iron in Kalen's gaze. She knew the heart of a soldier, and she knew the heart of a father. They were the same thing now. "I will protect him with my life, Kalen Vance," she whispered, "and I will tell him every day that he was the son of a man who saved a world." "That's my girl," Kalen said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. He moved with military precision. He hauled Pip toward the back of the cockpit, where the small 3-person escape pod was nestled. He shoved Pip inside, then helped Elowen into the seat beside him. "Papa, stop, please!" Pip was screaming now, his face red with effort as he tried to claw his way out. "I love you, kid," Kalen said. He reached in and tucked Sparky into Pip's arms. "Keep the bot safe. He's the vanguard now." Kalen slammed the pod's hatch. He didn't look through the window. He couldn't. He turned to the manual release lever and pulled it. There was a muffled thud as the explosive bolts fired. The pod fell away from the Stargazer, its small parachutes deploying a second later as it drifted toward the silver sprouts below. Kalen Vance was alone in the cockpit. The silence was absolute, save for the dying hum of the ship. He sat back in the pilot's seat and gripped the control stick. He felt a strange sense of peace. The fear was gone. The regret was gone. There was only the mission. "All right, you overgrown skag heap," Kalen muttered, looking up at the massive underbelly of Obsidian Orbit. "Let's see how you handle a holojack who's got nothing left to lose." He jammed the throttles forward. The Stargazer didn't roar. She groaned, her engines screaming as she burned through the last of her fuel reserves. He aimed for the station's main thermal exhaust port, a glowing red circle in the center of the docking ring. The 2 interceptors dived toward him, their cannons firing wildly. "Target lock," Kalen whispered. One shell took out his left wing. Another shattered the cockpit glass. The freezing air of the upper atmosphere rushed in, howling like a banshee. Kalen's HUD whited out. He was flying blind, guided only by the feeling in his gut and the memory of the Emerald Song. 500 meters, he counted. 400. He could see the individual rivets on the station's hull now. He could see the docking bay doors where he'd stood just yesterday, waiting for a bride he hadn't wanted. 300. He thought of Eliza. He thought of the way she used to sing off-key when she was happy. He wondered if she was watching. 200. Vance, pull up! You're going to kill us all! Pendrich's voice screamed over the emergency frequency. Kalen didn't answer. He smiled. It was a real smile, reaching all the way to his eyes. 100. For the choosing mama, Kalen whispered. For the boy with the big ideas. He slammed the stargazer into the exhaust port at 400 kilometers per hour. The world turned white. Down on the surface, Pip and Elowen stood in the dust, their hands linked as they looked up at the sky. A massive explosion blossomed in the purple clouds. A sun-bright sphere of fire that lit up the entire horizon. The shockwave hit a moment later, a warm wind that smelled of ozone and scorched copper. The great station above shuddered. Its descent slowed, then stopped. Then, with a series of groans that could be heard across the planet, its emergency thrusters fired. The massive metal beast began to rise, pushed back into the dark by the sacrifice of a single rusted ship. The interceptors, their command links severed, veered away, disappearing into the haze. Pip fell to his knees in the gray ash. He didn't cry. He just stared at the spot where the fire had been. "He's gone," the boy whispered. "Papa didn't make it." Elowen knelt beside him. She wrapped her green arms around him, pulling him close. She didn't offer empty words. She didn't tell him it was okay. "He is not gone, Pip," she said, her voice a low vibration that seemed to come from the ground itself. She pointed to the silver sprout at their feet. During the explosion, the little tree had grown. It was now 3 feet tall, its shimmering leaves vibrating with a new, stronger resonance. And then something impossible happened. The emerald glow of the tree began to pulse in a specific rhythm. 3 short pulses, 1 long. Pip's eyes went wide. That's Papa's knock, the one he used to do on the airlock when he came home from the night shift. Elowen looked at the forest starting to wake up all around them. The resonance of the planet wasn't just energy. It was a record, a memory of everything that had ever lived and breathed on its surface. By pouring his life and his choice into the planet's awakening, Kalen hadn't just saved them. He had become a part of the song. "He didn't just save the world, Pip," Elowen said, a single crystalline tear falling into the ash. "He became the world. Every tree that grows here, every breath of air we take, it will be because of him." Pip reached out and touched the silver leaf. It was warm. It felt like his father's hand. The boy stood up. He wiped the dust from his face with his sleeve. He looked at the vast gray plains that were slowly turning silver under the morning light. "Then we have to get to work," Pip said, his voice sounding older, steadier. "We have a lot of trees to plant, and Papa's going to need a lot of company." Elowen stood beside him, the Ouroborean exile and the boy from the station. They were a family of 2 now, held together by the memory of the one who had chosen them. "Yes," Elowen said, looking up at the blue window in the sky. "We have a world to build." Far above, the station drifted back into the darkness, a broken thing. But below, on the world once called a tomb, the first morning of a new era had begun. And in the rustle of the silver leaves, if you listened closely, you could hear the steady, rhythmic heartbeat of a man who had finally come home. The silence that followed the destruction of the stargazer was not the empty, hollow silence of the void. It was a heavy, vibrating thing, filled with the dying echoes of a hero's final shout. On the surface of Ethelgard, the copper mists had been blown back by the force of the thermal exhaust explosion, revealing a sky that was no longer bruised purple, but a deep bruised indigo, pinpricked by stars that had not been seen from this world in 30 years. Elowen of the Spires stood at the edge of the crater where the silver sprout had become a silver tree. Her green skin was caked in gray ash, and her scales were dull, but her eyes were fixed on the black, jagged silhouette of obsidian orbit as it ascended back into the safety of the dark. The station was wounded. Massive plumes of orange gas trailed behind it like the blood of a punctured beast. Kalen's strike had been precise. He hadn't destroyed the home of 10,000 people. He had simply severed its predatory grip on the world below. "He's really not coming back, is he?" Pip's voice was a ghost of a sound, drifting through the cooling air. He was sitting on a rusted equipment crate, his small hands buried in the silver leaves of the tree. Sparky, the one-armed robot, sat on his lap, its optic sensor pulsing in a slow, mournful green. The boy didn't look like a child anymore. In the space of 1 hour, the innocence that had led him to order a bride for his father had been burned away, replaced by the hard, sharp clarity of a survivor. Elowen walked over to him, her movements slow and pained. She knelt in the ash, ignoring the way it gritted against her crystalline skin. She didn't try to pull him into a hug. She knew that some grief was too large to be held. Kalen Vance was a soldier, Pip, she said, her voice a low, melodic thrum. And a hollowjack. He spent his life navigating the darkness so that others could find the light. He didn't die because he was unlucky. He died because he chose to give us his tomorrow. I hate this world, Pip whispered, his fingers tightening on the silver bark. I hate the ash. I hate the council. I hate the sky. Look at the tree, Pip. Elowen pointed to the shimmering leaves. Do you feel that? The vibration? Pip closed his eyes, his breathing hitching. He pressed his ear against the trunk. For a long time there was nothing. Then his eyes snapped open. It's humming. It sounds like the ship's engine, but softer. It is the resonance, Elowen explained. Kalen's choice, his final pulse of energy, it didn't just vanish. It was absorbed by the network I woke up. He is the first chord in the new song of Ethelgard. He is not gone, little one. He is just everywhere now. The sound of descending thrusters broke the moment. Elowen stood up, her hand instinctively going to the heavy wrench she had salvaged from the escape pod. But these weren't council interceptors. These were 3 mule haulers, clunky, unpainted utility ships used by the station's miners. They landed in a messy formation, their landing struts kicking up clouds of silicate. The hatches hissed open. Out stepped a group of men and women in grimy work suits. At their head was Grog, the massive engineer from the guts, and Harlan, the man with the scarred lungs. They weren't carrying pulse rifles. They were carrying oxygen tanks and crates of medical supplies. Vance, Grog called out, his voice echoing across the plain. Elowen, you out there? Elowen stepped into the light of their headlamps. Kalen is gone, Grog. He saved the station. The big man stopped, his shoulders sagging. He looked up at the sky, at the receding lights of Obsidian orbit. He took off his grease-stained cap and held it against his chest. Behind him, the other miners followed suit. We saw the blast from the guts, Harlan said, his voice a rattling wheeze. The council tried to tell us it was a reactor failure on the Stargazer. Said you were all dead. But then the sensors started going crazy. We saw the greenery. We saw the blue patch in the sky. He looked at the silver tree, his eyes wide with wonder. He reached out a trembling hand, then pulled it back as if afraid it would vanish. Is it real? Is the air? Is it coming back? It will take years, Elowen said. Maybe decades. But the cycle has restarted. The planet is breathing again. Grog looked at Pendrich's fleeing ships, then back at Elowen. The station is in a state of snafu, Elowen. Total chaos. The clankers have taken over the life support decks. We told the council that if they didn't let us come down to check on you, we'd vent the executive levels into the void. Pendrich is hiding in his bunker, but he's foobar. He's lost the people. He stepped closer, his heavy boots crunching in the ash. We don't want to go back up there. Not all of us. Some of us want to see if we can make a go of it down here. With the dirt. With the trees. Pip stood up then, his eyes red but fierce. You have to be careful. You can't just dig. You have to listen to the resonance. If you hurt the soil, it'll go silent again. Grog looked down at the boy, a small, crooked smile appearing on his face. Hear that, boys? The kid's the new foreman. We listen to him. For the next 48 hours, Ethelgard became a hive of frantic, beautiful activity. The miners brought down modular housing, water purifiers, and the heavy-duty solar arrays they had borrowed from the council's private reserves. They didn't build a city, they built an outpost at the foot of the Silent Spires, a place they began to call Vance's Landing. Elowen worked until she was nearly transparent with exhaustion. She showed the engineers how to weave the resonance seeds into the existing station tech, creating bioreactors that produced clean oxygen at 3 times the rate of the old scrubbers. She taught the children of the miners how to read the silver leaves, showing them how to tell when the soil needed nitrogen and when it was thirsty. But every evening, when the indigo sun set behind the obsidian peaks, she and Pip would walk to the center of the grove. The single silver tree had already produced 12 saplings, their leaves shivering in the wind. "I still miss him," Pip said one night, sitting on the ground and leaning against Alohan's legs. "I miss the way he smelled like engine oil in those terrible protein squares." Alohan ran her green fingers through his hair. "I miss him too, Pip. I miss the way he tried to be a hardjack while his heart was as soft as a seedling." "Why did he choose us?" Pip asked. "He could have just left. He could have taken the ship and gone to a nice planet in the inner rim." Elowen looked at the silver forest, then down at the boy who had crossed 47 light years to find her. "Because, Pip, he realized that a nice planet isn't a home. A home is where you are seen. He was a man who felt invisible for a long time. You saw him. I saw him. And in the end, he saw himself, not as a soldier, but as a father." She looked up at the stars, her amber eyes reflecting the light of 1,000 distant suns. "Family isn't a debt we are born with, Pip. It is a choice we make every morning when we wake up. Kalen Vance chose us, and now we choose to keep his world alive." Pip nodded, his small hand finding allowance. "I'm glad I picked you, Mama." The word Mama hung in the air, sweet and heavy as the scent of the resonance trees. Elawan felt a pulse of light ripple through her scales, a surge of belonging so profound it made her breath catch. "I am glad you picked me too, my son," she whispered. As the first rain in 30 years began to fall, a gentle, copper-scented drizzle that turned the gray ash into dark, rich mud, the people of Vance's Landing went to their beds. They slept the deep, peaceful sleep of people who finally had something worth building. And in the heart of the grove, the silver trees hummed a steady, 3-beat rhythm, a guardian's song that would echo across Ethelgard for 1,000 years to come. 5 years had passed since the day the sky turned blue. Ethelgard was no longer a world of gray and purple. From orbit, it looked like a shimmering emerald, wrapped in a veil of soft, white clouds. The silicate plains had been replaced by vast meadows of resonance grass, which pulsed with a soft green light whenever the wind moved through it. The singing spires, once the rusted fingers of a dead civilization, had been restored and repurposed. They were now the heart of the Ethelgard Agricultural Academy, where students from across 3 sectors came to learn the delicate art of bioresonant terraforming. Elowen stood on the observation deck of the primary spire, looking out over the valley. She was 43 years old now by the human calendar, though her Ouroborean longevity meant she looked much the same as the day she arrived. Her skin was a deep, healthy emerald, and her scales were vibrant, reflecting the afternoon sun like tiny polished mirrors. She wore a simple robe of woven silver fiber, the mark of a master geobotanist. "The northern quad is showing a 10% increase in moisture retention," a voice said from behind her. Elowen turned and smiled. Pip, now 10 years old, was walking toward her. He had grown tall and lean, with his father's broad shoulders and a steady, focused gaze that reminded Elowen of a pilot lining up a difficult docking. He wore a student's jumpsuit, stained with the dark, fertile soil of the valley. In his arms, he carried a newer, more advanced version of Sparky, a 2-armed robot that could now assist in delicate seed planting. "That's excellent, Pip," Elowen said. "Did you adjust the frequency of the irrigation pumps?" "Yeah," Pip said, leaning against the railing next to her. "I used the Vance pattern. 3 pulses, 1 long. The soil seems to like it best." He looked out at the valley where thousands of people were working in the fields. Vance's Landing had grown into a thriving city of 12,000 residents. The Rust Hulk mentality was gone, replaced by a culture of stewardship and shared purpose. Even Pendrick was a memory. The former counselor had been exiled to a small, barren moon 3 light years away, where he spent his days trying to manage a colony of one, himself. "The first full harvest of the iron grain is tomorrow," Pip said, his voice dropping to a more serious tone. "Are you ready for the ceremony?" "I am," Elowen said. "But it is your day, Pip. You are the one who managed the southern quadrants." Pip looked down at his hands, which were calloused and stained with the earth. "I just wish he could see it. Not just through the resonance, I mean." I wish he could stand here and taste the fruit. I think he'd really like the apples we grew in Sector 7. Elowen reached out and squeezed his shoulder. He does see it, Pip. Every time you fix a machine, every time you plant a seed, you are his hands. We are his legacy. They stood in silence for a while, watching the sun dip toward the horizon. The sky turned a brilliant golden amber. The clouds edged in fire. It was a sky that no catalog could ever do justice to. Elowen felt a familiar pull in her chest, a deep, resonant connection to the man who had died so she could live. She thought back to the woman who had stepped off the Star Skipper 5 years ago. She had been a fugitive, a woman who had given up on hope, believing that survival was the only goal. She had seen the world as a transaction, a series of risks and rewards. But Ethelgard had changed her. Pip had changed her. Kaelin had changed her. She realized now that her exile hadn't been a punishment. It had been an invitation. The universe hadn't sent her to a dying station because she was a match for a contract. It had sent her because she was the only one who could see the beauty hidden beneath the rust. And in trying to save a world, she had found the one thing she never thought she'd have, a family that didn't require a blood bond to be real. "Go on, Pip," Elowen said, gently nudging him. "Grog is waiting for you at the refinery. He said something about the secondary manifold being foobar, and he won't let anyone but you touch it." Pip laughed, a bright, clear sound that echoed in the spire. Typical Grog. He's been an engineer for 40 years, and he still can't handle a simple pressure leak. "I'll see you at dinner, Mama." He turned and ran toward the elevator, his boots clattering on the metal floor. Sparky chirped happily as it trotted after him. Elowen watched him go, her heart full. She turned back to the window, the indigo twilight beginning to settle over the singing fields. I remember the scent of engine grease and the feeling of cold carbon beneath my boots when I first arrived at Obsidian Orbit. I was a woman of logic, of science, of rigid Ouroborean principles. I believed that everything in this galaxy could be measured, categorized, and ultimately discarded when its utility was spent. I thought I was a terraformer, but I didn't know the first thing about growth. True growth isn't about nitrogen levels or carbon cycles. It is about the terrifying, beautiful act of opening your heart to someone who doesn't have to love you back. For so long, I defined myself by what I had lost: my home, my status, my sense of belonging. I thought I was an exile because the world had rejected me. I didn't understand that I was an exile because I had rejected the world. Kaelin Vance taught me that family is the ultimate act of salvage. He took the broken pieces of a life he didn't want, and with a stubbornness that only a human can possess, he built a sanctuary. He didn't wait for the world to be perfect to start loving it. He loved it while it was still ash and rust. He chose me not because I was the best match on a screen, but because I was someone he could choose to protect. And in that choice, we were both made whole. I am no longer a daughter of the spires or a fugitive of the void. I am a mother by choice, a steward of a living world, and a woman who knows that the most powerful resonance in the universe isn't a planetary frequency. It is the sound of a child calling your name. We are not bound by the stars we are born under, but by the promises we keep when the darkness comes. I look at the trees humming in the valley, and I wonder about the people still living on those stations, staring at flickering screens and breathing recycled air. They are waiting for someone to save them, for a miracle to fall from the sky. But I have learned that miracles don't fall. They are built piece by piece through the risks we take on each other. I spent my life running from a home that didn't want me, only to realize that home is not a place you find. It is a place you create with the people who choose to stay when everyone else leaves. I ask you, in the quiet moments of your own journey, is there someone in your life you have been treating as a variable or a transaction? What would happen if, just for today, you stopped looking for the perfect match and decided to be the one who chooses to stay? Elowen turned away from the window and picked up a small, silver leaf that had blown onto the deck. She pressed it against her cheek, feeling the warmth of the sun and the steady, rhythmic heartbeat of the planet beneath her feet. With a soft smile, she tucked the leaf into her pocket and walked toward the light of her home.